I grew up in a tight-knit religious community in the Midwest, the kind where everyone knows each other's business and devout obedience is the bedrock of faith. My parents were pillars of this congregation. My father led prayer sessions, and my mother taught Sunday school. From an early age, I was taught that questioning their authority was sinful, so I never did. I followed every rule, wore every modest dress, and recited every verse with careful devotion. My father hammered into my head that my duty was to become a good wife and mother, as though I existed solely for that purpose. His eyes brimmed with disapproval any time I displayed a trace of individuality. Over time, I felt my own identity slipping, replaced by someone who lived in constant fear of making a misstep. The older I got, the heavier that burden became, until I almost couldn't breathe. I was taught that my parents' word was final, and no deviation would be tolerated. When I was 16, my father threatened to break off my friendship with a neighbor's daughter simply because I asked about applying to a local community college. He told me I needed to focus on my real purpose, become a wife. The older I got, the more intense his demands became. By 19, they were pushing me to court a family friend, a man almost twice my age. They called it a blessed union, but I saw it as a prison sentence. He was the kind of man who rarely looked me in the eye, always spoke over me, and never seemed interested in anything beyond ensuring I'd be a compliant spouse. My mother supported all of it, convinced this was the best way to safeguard my soul. I felt trapped and hopeless. Around that time, I discovered a hidden stash of old textbooks in the attic. My mother's younger sister had left them behind years ago when she distanced herself from the family. Though we rarely spoke about my aunt, I'd overheard bits and pieces. She was the black sheep. She got into arguments with my father about everything from theology to women's rights, and eventually she packed up and left. Those textbooks were my first glimpse of a world outside my parents' narrow teachings. I devoured chapters on biology, world history, and literature in secret. By the time I turned 20, I knew I couldn't remain under my parents' roof for long. My aunt's example haunted me. If she could escape, maybe I could too. But I had no money and no idea how to start. My parents controlled every aspect of my life, from finances to social contact. I started babysitting for families within our community, hoping to earn a little cash. My father insisted I hand over the payments for household expenses, so I pretended to comply, slipping a few bills aside before giving the rest. It took months, but eventually I saved a modest sum. I was terrified of being caught. One night, I overheard my parents talking about finalizing the engagement with that family friend. My heart pounded as they said I'd be a bride by the following spring. Panic set in. I knew time was running out. Through an ancient computer in the church's youth room, I researched every place I could go where my parents might not find me. My mother had once mentioned missionaries in Kenya, so my search led me to a volunteer program in Nairobi. I applied, telling them I was desperate for a fresh start. They responded weeks later with an acceptance email. I almost fainted seeing those words on the screen. There was a small stipend and housing in a shared dorm, but I needed a plane ticket and enough money to cover living costs until my first payment. My stash wasn't enough, so I sold a gold necklace my grandmother had given me. It broke my heart to part with it, but I had no choice. Then I forged my father's signature on the passport application. I practiced it for days, terrified I'd get it wrong. When my passport arrived in the mail, I intercepted it before my parents could. Every step felt like a gamble. If they discovered my plans, I knew they'd lock me in the house until the wedding. Sometimes I wondered if leaving would be worth the risk, but my fear of staying was stronger. I finally slipped out one early morning when my parents believed I was heading to a church event. I had a small suitcase, my savings, and my passport tucked inside my coat. Getting on that plane still feels like a dream. My stomach churned the entire flight, and my nerves only intensified when I arrived in Nairobi. The volunteer group had arranged for a driver to pick me up, and he was a friendly Kenyan man with a warm smile who introduced himself as Peter. I'd never experienced such open kindness from a stranger. He helped me get situated in the shared dorm, which was a simple but welcoming place with a handful of other volunteers from different countries. I was homesick at first, but I also felt liberated in a way I'd never known before. Nobody was hovering over me, dictating my every move. The work itself involved assisting with educational programs for children in underprivileged areas. I found myself reading with groups of kids who barely had enough textbooks, and I helped organize art activities. The staff, including several locals, were patient with me as I adjusted to life in a new country. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I reminded myself that anything was better than becoming that man's subservient wife back home. Slowly, I built friendships with the other volunteers, especially a woman named Yasmin from France and a British man named Daniel. We bonded over evening meals, sharing stories about our lives. They found my background shocking. Yasmin insisted I was brave for running away, while Daniel said I was proof that even the most rigid situations had escape routes. Their support mattered to me because part of me felt shame, as if I'd betrayed my family's expectations. One evening, after a particularly rewarding day with the kids, I checked my phone and discovered a barrage of missed calls from an unknown number. My stomach dropped. Then I saw the voicemails. It was my father, sounding furious and almost hysterical. He demanded I return immediately, accusing me of disgracing the family and reneging on my God-given role. He threatened to contact the authorities, though I doubted he had any actual legal grounds to force me back. Still, the fear crept in. In his messages, he insisted I would be condemned to eternal punishment if I didn't come home. My mother left a tearful message, begging me to think of their reputation. That night, I barely slept, torn between guilt and a fierce determination never to return. I saved every voicemail, every text. I wasn't sure why, but some part of me sensed I might need them. 2 months passed, and I started to find my rhythm. I explored parts of the city with Yasmin and Daniel, learned basic Swahili phrases, and felt a sense of autonomy I'd never known. Then came the day my father's threats took a new turn. He claimed he knew secrets about my lineage that would devastate me if revealed. I assumed it was just another manipulation tactic, an attempt to lure me back by fear, but something in his tone made me wonder if he was serious. The next time he called, I answered, determined to stand my ground. He told me I'd been living a lie, that I was never his daughter biologically. He said my mother had sinned with another man and he'd raised me only out of duty. Hearing that left me rattled. I wanted to scream at him for lying, but he sounded convinced. After that call, I confronted my mother via text, demanding the truth. She initially denied everything, but a week later, she sent me a long, tearful email. She admitted I'd been conceived during a brief relationship with a foreign missionary who visited our church. My father found out when I was just a toddler. For years, they covered it up to keep appearances within the community. She also dropped another bombshell. The missionary was Kenyan, which she assumed was the reason I'd run to Africa, as if something drew me there subconsciously. I felt numb reading those words. It was surreal, learning my real father might be walking around somewhere in the same country I'd escaped to. Part of me wanted to search for him, to see if he even knew about me. Another part felt furious at the lies. My father's hypocrisy was unimaginable. In the days that followed, I was paralyzed with conflicting emotions. Yasmin and Daniel urged me to seek counseling. With their help, I connected to a local therapist who specialized in cross-cultural issues. Unpacking the realization that the man I'd called dad all my life wasn't actually related to me was both shocking and, in some strange way, freeing. It explained why he treated me so harshly compared to my younger brothers. It also confirmed that his insistence on marrying me off was less about love or faith and more about getting rid of a constant reminder of my mother's sin. That realization ignited a new resolve in me. I decided I wasn't done fighting. He wanted me to stay quiet, to slip back and let him maintain his facade. But I'd learned from the voicemails and threats that he feared public embarrassment above all. I reached out to an old friend who'd left our congregation a few years earlier. She still lived in the same town and had connections with community members who were unhappy with my father's authoritarian rule. With her guidance, I drafted an anonymous letter detailing the abuse, the forced courtship, and the truth about my paternity. I included snippets of his voicemails, carefully transcribed, where he threatened me. My friend circulated these letters among several families in the church, slipping them into mailboxes under the cover of night. It was a bold move, but I wanted to expose him for the hypocrite he was. My father had used the pulpit to shame other congregants for lesser sins, all while concealing the fact that he'd built his entire family on a lie. The fallout was immediate. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the church started asking questions. My father's reputation took a hit, but he doubled down, calling me a tool of the devil. He gave a sermon in which he described me as an ungrateful daughter corrupted by worldly influences. He denied everything, labeling the letters as forgeries. That's when I decided to release audio clips of his voicemails. My friend posted them online, tagging various community members and even a few local journalists. In those recordings, his rage was on full display, complete with biblical curses and threats to have me brought back in chains. Once the audio leaked, some of his staunchest supporters started to waver. People realized he was capable of cruelty behind closed doors. Church elders confronted him. Some demanded he step down from leadership. Others tried to defend him, but the damage was undeniable. My mother's silence added fuel to the fire, making people suspect the worst. Back in Nairobi, I received countless messages from church acquaintances, some offering support, others spewing the same old judgmental rhetoric. I felt a surge of empowerment. Everything he'd tried to bury was finally coming to light. Meanwhile, I focused on my volunteer work and tried to find any lead on my biological father. My mother offered scant details, claiming she didn't know much beyond his first name and the fact that he'd volunteered with an international organization decades ago. It felt like a long shot, but I approached a few local mission groups, hoping someone might remember a Kenyan who served in the US around the time I was conceived. Most had no records that far back, yet I refused to give up. If he was still alive, I believed I had the right to at least meet him once. That desire fueled me forward. My revenge against my father wasn't complete. A few months after the letters and audio clips went public, I learned he was still preaching, though attendance had dropped. He was also pressuring my mother to disown me entirely. I decided to strike again, this time with a more personal blow. I knew from experience that our congregation valued financial integrity almost as much as religious piety. With help from my friend, I got hold of a partial financial report from the church. We highlighted suspicious expenses that hinted at misuse of funds. My father had been channeling donations into his personal bank account. We compiled the evidence and sent it to the church's board and a local newspaper. The scandal that followed dwarfed the earlier drama. Accusations flew, and some members threatened legal action. My father's world of moral superiority began crumbling even more. Meanwhile, I kept searching for my biological father. As luck would have it, a local pastor named Samuel heard about my story through the volunteer network. He remembered an older Kenyan gentleman who'd gone to the US for a mission trip about 24 years ago. Samuel helped me track down a retired teacher named Lucas. The moment I met Lucas, I felt an odd sense of calm. He had kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. We talked for hours. He admitted he'd once volunteered in the Midwest, but he swore he knew nothing about a child. He'd had a brief relationship with a woman there, but it ended before he returned to Kenya. We decided to do a DNA test, though I tried not to get my hopes up. Weeks later, the results confirmed he was my father. Both of us just sat there, stunned. He cried quietly, apologizing for never knowing I existed. He told me he'd have made different choices if he'd known. I believed him. Lucas wasn't some saint, but he seemed honest, a stark contrast to the man who'd raised me under intimidation and lies. He asked me endless questions about my life, and we bonded over little things like our shared interest in reading. Meeting him gave me a feeling of closure. Yet, it also opened a door to a world I'd never anticipated. He introduced me to some of his relatives, who welcomed me with open arms. They didn't judge me for my past. Instead, they marveled at how I'd managed to find my way here. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere without pretense or shame. It was everything my upbringing lacked. I felt both exhilarated and a little sad. Although I felt more at peace, I couldn't ignore what was happening back home. My father was under investigation for embezzlement of church funds, and certain authorities were looking into whether he'd coerced minors into arranged marriages. Some families stepped forward with disturbing stories of similar treatment. My mother tried to reach me multiple times, but I refused to answer her calls. She had enabled him for so many years, standing by in silence while he planned to marry me off. I remembered the humiliation, the threats, the suffocating fear. I realized I owed her nothing, not even a chance to explain her side. I'd given her opportunities before, and she never once stood up for me. I chose to remain distant, focusing on my new life. If that seemed heartless, so be it. I felt justified knowing what they'd all put me through. In time, the legal proceedings escalated. My father was removed from his role. My friend kept me updated on every development. The congregation was in turmoil, divided between loyalists and those who believed he had deceived them for years. Donations plummeted, lawsuits loomed. I felt a strange satisfaction knowing I'd played a part in dismantling his toxic kingdom. It wasn't a matter of pettiness. It was about ensuring he couldn't harm anyone else the way he'd harmed me. Back in Nairobi, I continued volunteering, rooming with Yasmin and Daniel, and forging a relationship with Lucas. He offered to help me pursue further education. I'd never dreamed of attending a proper university, yet here was an unexpected chance to reinvent myself entirely. My father had tried to push me into a corner to break my spirit. Instead, I found a future filled with possibilities I'd never imagined. I often think about the life I left behind. Sometimes I wonder if my mother regrets standing by him, or if my brothers resent me for upending everything. But I've come to realize that none of that truly matters. I have my own life to live now, and I won't waste another moment seeking their approval. I found a family in Lucas and his relatives, genuine friends in Yasmin and Daniel, and a sense of purpose I'd never thought possible. My father's downfall was his own doing. All I did was bring his secrets into the light. He wanted to marry me off, trap me in a cycle of submission and silence, but he failed. I have no pity for him, nor do I offer any forgiveness. He betrayed me from the start, and he deserved every ounce of justice that found him. Now, I'm saving up for university tuition and planning a future that doesn't hinge on anyone's permission. Part of me remains angry at all the years I lost, but I channel that anger into determination. If anyone reading this feels stuck in a life they didn't choose, I hope you find your path to freedom. Mine led me here, and I have no regrets. I am truly free, and that, more than anything, is the sweetest victory I could ever claim.